Welcome to Frankly Speaking. My name is Onkgopotse JJ Tawani. We're coming to you live from Auckland Park here at the SABC in Johannesburg. And tonight we focus on state-owned enterprises. These have been in the news for all the wrong reasons. Corruption on one hand, poor governance, mismanagement, you name it, it is there. Can they be redeemed? The new Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, is my guest tonight to discuss these and other matters. But hey, last week was another interesting week in South Africa, isn't it? The Guptas in the news again. Are they citizens or are they not? Well, after the Minister Malusi Gigaba and the DG Apleni spoke, I still remained a little bit none the wiser. Well, let's take a look at some of the highlights of that story.
Insofar as we at Home Affairs are concerned, the two gentlemen are not South African citizens.
We can confirm that indeed a certain Abdul Gupta is properly registered at primary school in Saxonwold. In order for a person to register, you've got to be a South African citizen, and you've got to be in possession of either a barcoded ID or alternatively, you've got to have a smart card.
Minister Gigaba never dealt with the granting of citizenship to Abdul Gupta, who was naturalized on November 2002, having satisfied the ordinary resident requirements for naturalization.
Well, spare thought for my friend Maihlome Jwete, who has to spin all of that. You know, it's difficult, man, when you don't know who to believe. And of course, civil servants getting caught in the crossfire. You can follow our show on hashtag Frankly Speaking, as you can tweet us at JJ Tabani. You can also tweet at SABC online. Of course, you know, whether you believe it or them or not, we've got to talk to public officials. And tonight we're talking to former Minister of Finance, but current Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan. Let's go talk frankly to him. Minister, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know you're quite busy, and we really appreciate it for you to come and talk to the people here on Frankly Speaking.
Well, thank you very much for having me. You know, SOEs are complex structures, and like the Guptas, they've been in the news for a while, except that they're not registered at any shebeen in Saxonwold. So,
look, you know, Saxonwold, I mean, 1 minute they say shebeen, and now at least today they refer to a primary school, which gives us all hope. Are you happy to be back in cabinet, and were you expecting it at all?
Well, I was in Parliament and having great fun, but also great pleasure at making Parliament relevant once again, and the focus of public attention together with colleagues in the Public Enterprises Portfolio Committee. And the public must compliment the leadership of the Portfolio Committee for livening up Parliament, for holding public officials to account, and also bringing out the truth, even if that truth meant continuous denials. I don't know, I never knew, nobody told me, etc.
Others may think you had unfair advantage because probably half of the stuff they were telling you, you knew better because you're Minister of Finance. Half of the stuff had to do with procurement, had to do with how public finances were managed. Do you think that some of the stuff that came out of there, you could have picked them up earlier as a person who was an overall custodian of public finances and therefore clamped down to almost reduce the extent to which there was so much that was going wrong, particularly on finances in those enterprises, Minister?
Well, the brief of Treasury is fairly narrow. It's to watch the finances of the state-owned entities. Secondly, as we began to get into fiscal difficulties, particularly after the recession in 2009-10, that impacted on our revenues and our ability to spend, clearly we had to be more mindful of the kind of bailouts that many of these entities were seeking. And in many instances, whether it's the SABC, by the way, or any of those entities, conditions were attached, both by the relevant minister and by the Treasury, for funds or guarantees that were given at the time. What we did pick up are certain procurement maladies, but we didn't quite put the whole picture together in the form that it later emerged, particularly as a result of the emails.
But would that sort of put a question mark on the strategy to have a central procurement system? You had somebody called the chief procurement officer, and God bless that guy, because essentially he was expected to have an overall view of what's happening in procurement. So with Eskom having asked for a 23 billion rand bailout at some point, surely one would argue that the systems should have been in place much better to ensure that that 23 billion isn't wasted, while in fact you are dealing with a crisis, to try and make sure that Eskom remained liquid, Minister.
Well, again, on the Treasury side, we had a very limited view. And that office, the Central Procurement Office, was just about being set up at the time. Its powers have been slightly weakened, and I'm sure under Minister Nene and President Ramaphosa, those powers will be strengthened once again, because many of these entities had the right to even say to the Treasury, sorry, we're not giving you this information, or we're not sharing that forensic report with you, and those sorts of obstructive tactics. But it's the Department of Public Enterprises, currently under my responsibility, that must actually develop more effective oversight over not just finances, but the operations, both on a governance point of view, but also what happens in those entities at a day-to-day level.
Yes.
And that's our job over the next year or so.
A lot of people were surprised that SAA was placed under Treasury instead of under Public Enterprises. And what you've just mentioned now would mean that SAA would miss out on that oversight by Public Enterprise. Would you argue that, first of all, whether something like SAA should be under Public Enterprises, or in fact, maybe you would argue that you don't need a Department of Public Enterprises and particular line functions must oversee their relevant SOEs? What would be your overall approach on something like that?
I think that's part of the review that the President, I think, is initiating of number of cabinet positions, number of departments, which departments takes accountability for those respective functions. But there are many other things that we need to look at carefully as well, particularly with President Ramaphosa's emphasis on implementation. So policies are fine, and many departments have got used to the idea of formulating policies, but it's the effect on the ground, it's the impact it makes on the citizens of this country, but also all the maladies that seek to penetrate what we actually try to do. So maybe that's a question in a year's time that needs to be addressed. I think our immediate concern is to get the governance right, as the President says, make sure we have effective management teams, effective and honest boards, because this criminality, allegedly, or let's say malfeasance, has crept, as you know.
We'll come to that, because I want you to give me an assessment of what you think is going wrong with the SOEs after the break. But before we go to the break, did it mean that if you had SAA under Treasury during your tenure, you needed then to have aviation experts in Treasury who can oversee? Because how do they oversee this massive multi-billion entity that's dealing with a specific subject matter called aviation, if indeed they are not experts themselves?
Well, there's three issues there. The first is the financial issue, which the Treasury had competence to deal with.
Yes.
The second is the strategy of an airline and whether it's effective enough to become self-sustaining. And the third is the governance. And as you know, for some time, there was an insistence that Ms. Mieni remains the chair of the board.
And you battled to get rid of her, even after 5 billion loss.
Well, that's for history to record.
We're going to talk after the break on your assessment of what are the two or three big themes that have occurred to you as you are, getting a handover on Public Enterprise, but also as someone who has been dealing with these enterprises a little bit. We're talking to Minister Gordhan, who is the newly appointed Minister of Public Enterprises. After the break, we continue that conversation.
SABCnews.com is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. With a website that is easy to use on mobile, SABC News prides itself in being the primary source of public service content across multiple platforms. Watch live streams of all the big news events on the SABC News YouTube channel, which is one of the most viewed South African YouTube channels globally. And catch up on the best of SABC television and radio news. Follow breaking news on all of the SABC News social media platforms. Interact with SABC News on Facebook and stay connected on Twitter for the latest headlines and real-time updates by our reporters. SABC News, everywhere.
Technology is used for both positive and negative.
Some governments block the internet in times of protest.
With this internet blackout, it's impossible for me to do it, so I have to travel to Douala.
This act is a true violation of the rights of citizens.
In Africa, people are always coming up with innovative ways to use technology to solve some of their problems.
The more interesting piece of technology is actually the artificial intelligence.
AI, it's utilizing data to make your life easier.
Our network will give you Africa's technology and social media news.
For all your technology news, join Siphumelele Zondi every Saturday at 17:30.
32 nations, 44 matches live on SABC1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. You can follow our show on hashtag Frankly Speaking. You can tweet us at JJ Tavani at SABC News Online. We're talking to Minister Pravin Gordhan, the Minister of Public Enterprises. Minister, now, what is your assessment? I know that, there could be hundreds of things that go wrong, but 2 or 3 big things that you say, these are things that have gone wrong, that have made, that have given such a bad name to our state-owned enterprises.
Well, I suppose the first thing is the politics. And what the academics who produced the report, Betrayal of the Promise, talk about as repurposing of the state. In other words, making sure that you replace boards or management or remove any obstacles, be they human or otherwise, in order to achieve the purposes of extracting money. The second, as a consequence of that, is governance. The quality of people on the boards, the collaboration with efforts to undermine these institutions so that a few can actually benefit from them. The third is skilled management that would make sure that the right things are done and the mission of these institutions being economic development, transformation and service delivery and infrastructure investment in certain cases actually happens. And then lastly, fourthly, oversight, both by the public, by NGOs and by Parliament itself, somewhere along the line failed in the process.
Let's try and tackle one by one. Governance. I worry about the quality of the board members that we put in the SOEs. Do you think part of the problem is that the positions on the board are actually seen as employment instead of being seen as service, where after you have done your bit, made your money, made your impact, you now give back by saving on these boards? Is this something that you would have to look at in terms of criteria to get people to be on boards of these SOEs?
Well, partly it was jobs, but partly it was also an opportunity to access tenders or get friends to access tenders and other benefits from state-owned enterprises and ensure that public funds went into private pockets rather than public benefits. At the end of the day, the president, when he was deputy president, made a good start by restructuring, in fact, nominating virtually a completely new ESCOM board, getting a combination of experienced and less experienced people. And that's beginning to show an impact. They still have to put an effective management
that board
team
itself already not without controversy, with people criticizing that some of the people there are too close to the president and saying, but this is what happened previously. How are you going to avoid that conflict of interest that's often raised about public officials also being businessmen at the same time?
No, you've got to draw a clear line, make sure that the normal governance standards that are written in whether King 4 codes or the Companies Act or the Memoranda of Incorporation or our own standards that we want to develop a lot more rigorously in the department are actually abided by. But secondly, you've got to keep an eye on every individual, whether it's a minister or a board member or the chair of a board or the executives, and hold them accountable, because these, as you correctly say, are public institutions. So we've got to reintroduce the culture of service to Mamina. Right? So we want more and more skilled people to actually make themselves available. Secondly, get rid of the fear that people had, and good professionals walked away from boards and management. And this includes black professionals who say, I won't associate myself with this institution because I'll dirty my name. So we're entering a period where we must give them a guarantee they're not going to dirty their name, and their service and their skills are very welcome.
Did you get the chance to reflect? Because a lot of people were also nervous about the fact that people like yourselves, other ministers, have shares in companies, right? But at the same time, they have to oversee, the public purse, whereas those companies may also come and bid for the public purse. In the time that you were not a minister, right, I mean, a lot of people criticizing white monopoly capital and what have you. Can you just talk to me once and for all about that? Do you think that it's a problem that a minister of state, and you're going to be now even more powerful minister in charge of multi-billion institutions, should divest themselves from this kind of possible involvement in private business?
No, I'm not involved in business. I'm not involved in buying or selling shares. And we must put this...
So that's all fake news.
We must put this Bell Pottinger and ANN7 era behind us.
Yes.
Those are... Anybody who saves in South Africa in a pension fund or provident fund or through an investment account in a bank or financial institution, as you know, will have those invested in bonds or in property or in cash or in shares. And those are openly disclosed to Parliament. And I'll even make sure...
In terms of the ethics of Parliament.
Yeah, I'll make sure I don't trade in shares, and I haven't done that ever in my life.
You seem to allow some of these stories to carry on. Maybe you're not the kind of guy who would go out and try and contest. Because if you look at, let's take an example of the Minister of Minerals. If that person is known to have shares of whatever nature in a mining entity, that creates a conflict. Do you think there must be a stricter measures that says you are a public official, you are an MP, don't get involved in business? And that could be the same criteria that is given to people who must now come and operate at public enterprises.
I think the Parliamentary Code does allow MPs to earn an income outside of parliamentary income, provided their chief whips allow it. I don't know too much about that because I haven't inquired into that. Secondly, before some people join politics, they might have been business people.
Yes.
And what you make sure is that those are handled on a blind trust basis. In other words, I give you all of my financial affairs to deal with. Don't tell me where you invest my money. Don't tell me what I benefit until my term of office has actually expired.
To lessen the conflict.
Yeah, and there's no conflict. And finally, state-owned enterprises are not listed in the proper sense of the word. So you can't buy their shares and sell their shares. Not yet, anyway.
Another thing that I found, and I want you to really talk frankly to me about it, is there a reluctance in government circles to have a proper public-private partnerships in also is from a point of view of ownership? So SAA, you mentioned 2 years ago already that you're going to be looking for a possible investor, etc. It's 2 years later. That doesn't happen. SAA is still 100% the responsibility of the state. Can you address me on that a little bit?
So under the previous cabinet, there was a set of policy issues that were agreed upon. For example, what's the governance model? How do you choose board members? What's the procedure for remuneration? And one of those policies was the question of private sector participation. So that's the first point. So it is a policy of government. The second is that we've got to now execute that policy so that many of these entities remain under public control, but you can have a 25% or whatever it is.
It sounds like an obvious solution for you instead of you bailing out these entities all the time.
The question is, if you had $1 million, would you invest it in SAA? Today.
Not now.
Not now. So
not now. Not when you have failed to get rid of a chairman who made the thing lose 5 billion.
So part of our task now as government as a whole is to turn these entities into credible businesses, sustainable businesses.
Before you go out to get the partners.
And then you can get, if you try to sell a junk entity, Today, 25% might be worth 25 million rands.
So they'll buy it for a song.
Tomorrow, it could be worth 250 million rands. So we will be letting the public down if we don't.
But
do
it's
the
not
right
a chicken and egg setup in that you may fail to turn them around if you don't bring relevant expertise from the private sector.
That's what we will have to consider in the course of the next couple of months as to how do you balance those two factors out.
Right.
And already you have, for example, independent power producers, which are a form of public-private partnership. The Treasury guarantees their investment, and we've got, almost 200 billion rands of investment, either in real terms or potential terms.
In fact, after the break, I want to zone into that one, because ESCOM, at some point, actually just said, no, we actually don't need these producers anymore because there's no longer load shedding. But we'll talk to about that after the break, to also look at the quality of management that we put at these entities. We're talking to Minister Pravin Gordhan. You can follow us on hashtag Frankly Speaking. After the break, we carry on that conversation.
32 nations, 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
No. Yes. Yes.
Sports Live every Saturday and Sunday at 7:30 p.m.
Welcome to Media Monitor, the show that analyzes the big news stories that made headlines. We bring you robust discussions on stories that made headlines in the week, where we interact with media analysts to unpack these top stories. Join me every Sunday morning from 9 to 10 Central African Time as I bring you riveting news and analysis.
Stay tuned to Media Monitor every Sunday from 9 a.m.
32 nations, 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm in conversation with the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan. Minister, on Twitter, Letona Kadase says, should the current executives be allowed to correct their incompetence by firing people? Because some SOEs are said to retrench people because, the financial situation is bad and so on. How would you deal with that kind of situation of executives and their competence at these SOEs?
Well, as I explained earlier on, part of taking control or capturing these entities was to eventually capture the CEO, CFO, or top officials. Now, you will recall that according to evidence given to the Parliamentary Committee, Mr. Sotsi said he was instructed to suspend 4 officials, including Mr. Motana.
Yes.
Then they all exited in one form or another, and comes along Brian Molefe and Anoj Singh. And a whole lot of things follow thereafter, including the Tegeta coal deal. And you can see in the last 2 weeks, certainly in the last week, Minister Mantashe has been meeting workers there to find some solution to the fact that having got hold of this mine, the workers can't be paid their salaries. So you take over the board makes sure that the good managers are either sidelined or they're replaced. Once the new managers come in, they do what is actually required to be done. So I think the public needs to make a very strong call to all of the managers in all of these entities. You are public servants. You are there to serve the public interest. And if you think that you haven't served the public interest, go to Deputy Chief Justice Zondo's Commission of Inquiry and plead guilty or give them whatever information you have about how you abused this entity. and what shenanigans you've been up to.
You've raised a very important thing about the politics coming into the way, and I find that executives sometimes get interference both from the board, who are supposed to oversee them,
and from the politicians.
And then from the politicians.
Yes.
How are you going to insulate them, right, from being able to do their jobs? Because some of them actually don't want their careers destroyed by going to work for some of these entities, Minister.
But that's what I said earlier on, in interacting with black professionals. I've been told that face to face, that I will never go to institution X. Now, I've been there. 6 months later, I had to leave to save my own dignity on the one hand, and reputation and professionalism on the other hand. So we want, over a period of time, to professionalize management so that they do serve the public purpose, that they get their fair remuneration without getting exotic bonuses in the process for not actually doing much, and understand what these institutions are all about and help us to actually direct them in the right way, grow the economy, invest in the economy, and create jobs for young South Africans in particular, but also learning and apprenticeship opportunities, as President Ramaphosa has been calling.
So your big vision, and I know that, I mean, it's only a few days, and we'll probably ask you to come back in 100 days, but what should we judge you on? One or two big things before we round off today's segment.
Well, I think what the President set out in the State of the Nation address, i.e., get rid of as many corrupt elements and corruption as much as possible. Secondly, get credible boards. Thirdly, have credible and professional managers. And fourthly, make sure that the institutions perform their core mandates and not get into frills of all kinds.
And do you think you will revise the criteria for selecting people who must be custodians of the, given what you've seen at the ESCOM inquiry? Some of these guys don't seem to have been having a clear understanding of what is expected of them when they run these huge entities.
You know, the problem has been that some of them thought they're serving a particular suburb of Johannesburg rather than the country as a whole. And once you mistake the two, then you get yourself into serious trouble. So the criteria are fine. You want people who have business knowledge, you have people who have that industry knowledge, let's say an airline or a logistics entity. Thirdly, you want chartered accountants. Fourthly, you want people of credibility to chair the audit and risk committees. Fifthly, you want HR skills. Sixth, you want some legal skills. And seventh, perhaps, you need to have positions for 2 or 3 people who are going to learn what it means to sit on a board. And as you know, some of the trade unions have also said, can we participate in the boards? So that's an issue.
So the governance has to be balanced with all of those skills.
All of those skills.
To make sure that you don't have a situation where when their term ends, you have to start from the beginning. One of the big things that people are wondering is how the SOA landscape, right, can improve the whole area of black economic empowerment. And I want to talk about that in our next segment, because we've run out of time for this week, but we will continue this conversation next week. And thank you so much, Minister, for being our guest tonight. We're going to continue this conversation next Sunday, because we have run out of time now. So you must stay tuned. Next Sunday, we continue this conversation with the Minister of Public Enterprises. Again, you can follow our show on #FranklySpeaking. Until we talk frankly again, may God bless you.
Corruption both in the public